On a quiet street corner, bathed in the harsh, sudden glare of emergency lights, uniformed officers moved in with a casual authority, expecting easy compliance. But the woman they approached stood perfectly still, her silence a challenge that instantly shifted the air. The siren light strobed against the brick wall behind her, painting alternating red and blue shadows across her face. Officer Davis stepped closer, his shadow falling over her shoes. His hand rested on his belt. The other officer, Miller, stayed back a few paces, surveying the street with a bored expression that didn't reach his eyes. The air felt thin, charged. Jasmine didn't flinch. She held a small portfolio case loosely by her side. Her gaze was steady, level, not defiant, just present. Davis cleared his throat. "Ma'am, step away from the corner." His voice was flat, official. She didn't move her feet. Only her head tilted slightly. She didn't ask why. She just waited. The portfolio case felt solid, familiar, a small anchor in the sudden disruption. The corner was just a corner. She hadn't been doing anything. The silence stretched, thick and unexpected. Officer Davis shifted his weight. His hand tightened slightly on his belt. Miller's eyes flickered back towards them. "We're clearing the area," Davis added, his tone gaining a slight edge. "Orders." Still no words from her. Just the steady gaze, the still posture. The red and blue light washed over them again. A car slowed down across the street. Its headlights caught them for a second, then it continued on slowly. The quiet hum of the city felt distant. Her breathing was even. Inside, a tightness began to form behind her ribs, not panic, but a familiar, cold vigilance. This was not about clearing the area. This was about her in the area. "Ma'am? Did you hear me?" Davis's voice was harder now. His jaw was set. She finally spoke, her voice quiet, clear, cutting through the artificial tension he was trying to build. "I heard you, officer. I'm not obstructing anything. I'm standing on a public sidewalk." Her calmness seemed to surprise him. He blinked. Miller's head turned fully towards them now. The bored look was gone. Davis took another half step forward. He was close enough she could see the faint sheen of sweat on his upper lip under the flashing lights. "We need you to move now," he repeated, his tone bordering on a command. "For your safety. There's activity down the block." She didn't ask what activity. Her eyes stayed locked on his. Her stillness seemed to amplify his movement, making his slight fidgeting, the tightening of his fists stand out. The portfolio case hung heavy in her hand. Her knuckles were white. She noted it, filed it away. She didn't let it show on her face. The air grew heavier. "Officer," she said, her voice still measured, "are you giving me a lawful order to disperse?" His brow furrowed. The question wasn't what he expected. He seemed to momentarily lose his footing on the conversational terrain. He recovered quickly, but the brief hesitation was visible. "Yes," he said, perhaps too quickly. "Yes, I am. Disperse. Now." "Under what specific statute or ordinance are you ordering me to disperse from a public sidewalk, officer?" she asked. Her tone was genuinely curious, not challenging, which made it more disarming. He paused again. He hadn't expected questions, let alone questions about specific statutes. His gaze flickered towards Miller, who remained impassive. Davis puffed out his chest slightly. "Look, ma'am, I don't need to explain myself to you. It's a lawful order. Move." Her lips pressed together for a fraction of a second. A slow breath filled her lungs, held, then released imperceptibly. The tightness behind her ribs eased, replaced by a sharp, focused clarity. She wasn't going to yell. She wasn't going to plead. "Officer," she said, her voice dropping slightly, gaining a quiet weight. "I understand you believe you are giving a lawful order. My question is simple. What is the legal basis for it? Am I suspected of a crime? Am I blocking traffic? Is there a declared state of emergency or protest?" He bristled. His face flushed slightly under the flashing lights. He wasn't used to being questioned like this on the street. not with this quiet insistence. "You're being difficult, ma'am," he said, his voice tight. "You're delaying us. I'm asking for the reason behind an order restricting my movement in a public space," she responded calmly. "I believe I have a right to understand that." Miller finally stirred, taking a step forward. He was larger than Davis, his presence more overtly physical. He didn't speak, just watched her, his eyes assessing. The pressure increased, not through words, but through proximity and silence. "Just move, lady," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. "We told you to move." She turned her head slightly to look at Miller, then back at Davis. Her gaze held no fear, only a deep, unwavering calm. It was the look of someone who understood the power dynamics at play and refused to play by the expected script. "Officers," she said, her voice steady, addressing both of them now. "I am standing here quietly on a public sidewalk. I have not committed any offense. I am not causing a disturbance. If you cannot articulate a legal reason for me to leave, then ordering me to do so constitutes an unlawful detention and potentially harassment." The word harassment hung in the air. Officer Davis's eyes widened slightly. Miller's jaw tightened. They exchanged a quick, unreadable glance. The confident air they had arrived with began to fray. "Harassment? Now hold on, lady," Davis said, his voice rising. "Don't go making accusations." "I'm stating a legal principle, officer," she replied. "The requirement for a lawful order. If there is no legal basis, the order is not lawful. Issuing unlawful orders repeatedly, without basis, feels coercive. Wouldn't you agree?" She didn't wait for an answer. Her gaze remained steady, challenging them not with aggression, but with facts and calm logic. It was the opposite of what they seemed prepared for. They were expecting fear, or anger, or perhaps defiance they could easily label and address with force. They were met with quiet, intelligent resilience. A few more people had started to gather on the opposite side of the street, drawn by the flashing lights and the unusual stillness of the interaction. They stood silently, watching. The presence of onlookers seemed to make the officers more rigid, more aware of being observed. "Look, we're just doing our job," Davis said, his voice a little less certain now. He gestured vaguely down the street. "There's potential trouble. We need everyone out of the way." "Potential trouble is not the same as a clear and present danger requiring immediate dispersal of lawful citizens from public space," she stated, her tone still measured but firm. "That's a crucial distinction, officer." She shifted her weight slightly, settling more firmly on her feet. The portfolio case felt heavy but grounding. Her fingers flexed around the handle. She noticed the subtle tension in Davis's shoulders, the way Miller's eyes darted between her and the small group of onlookers. The power dynamic was beginning to tilt, not because she was loud or aggressive, but because she was calm, informed, and refused to be intimidated by their authority alone. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" Miller asked, his voice low, a hint of warning in it. "I am asking for the legal justification for your order," she repeated. "Cooperation implies a mutual understanding of purpose and legality. I am ready to cooperate with any lawful request. I am questioning the lawfulness of this request." Her eyes held his. She wasn't backing down. The silent onlookers across the street felt like silent witnesses, their presence a quiet amplification of the moment. The air crackled, not with rage, but with a taut, intellectual standoff. The officers were clearly uncomfortable. They were losing control of the narrative. This wasn't a simple compliance issue. Davis seemed to search for something in his mind, a regulation, a phrase, anything that would reassert his authority. He couldn't find it, or couldn't articulate it under her steady gaze. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, more to Miller than to her. "What is ridiculous, officer?" she immediately asked. "My desire to understand the legal basis for restricting my movement." She took a single, small step forward, not aggressively, but deliberately, closing the distance slightly. It was a subtle shift in posture, but it felt significant. It was her reclaiming space. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," Miller said, his voice a low threat. He took a step forward too, mirroring her movement. Her eyes didn't waver. The easy way would be for you to either provide the legal justification for your order or allow me to continue standing here, she said. The hard way, I presume, involves you exceeding your authority. Which way do you intend to proceed, officers? Her question hung in the air, quiet but heavy with implication. She was forcing them to state their intentions, to articulate their actions. The silence that followed was profound. The only sounds were the distant city hum and the rhythmic whoop of the police lights. Davis looked increasingly flustered. He glanced at Miller again. Miller's face was unreadable, but his posture had lost some of its casual confidence. He seemed unsure how to respond to this level of composed, legalistic resistance. They were officers trained in physical control and verbal commands, not constitutional debate on a street corner. Look! Davis started, his tone changing slightly, becoming almost pleading. We just need you to move. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal, officer, she countered gently. It's the principle. The arbitrary restriction of movement without cause. That's a very big deal. She paused, letting her words sink in. The small crowd across the street seemed to lean forward collectively. She felt their attention like a physical force. Are you saying you cannot provide a legal reason for me to disperse? She asked directly. Davis hesitated for too long. He opened his mouth, closed it. Miller remained silent, his gaze fixed on her face. The answer was clear in their inability to give one. Fine, Davis said finally, his voice low, defeated. He gestured vaguely. Just stay out of the way then. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of error. But it was a retreat. A complete reversal from the initial confident command. He took a step back. Miller also took a step back, his eyes still narrowed, but the overt pressure was gone. Jasmine held their gaze for another moment, her expression unreadable. She didn't offer a triumphant smile or a sharp parting remark. She simply nodded once, slowly. Thank you, officer, she said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute finality. She didn't move from her spot immediately. She stood there for a few more seconds watching them. Davis avoided her eyes, looking down the street. Miller met her gaze briefly, then looked away. The dynamic had shifted utterly. Slowly, reluctantly, the officers turned and walked away, heading further down the street, the red and blue lights receding with them. The pressure lifted. The air seemed to expand. The small group of onlookers across the street began to murmur, some nodding their heads, some watching her with open curiosity. She remained on the corner. She could feel the lingering tension, the residue of the interaction. It settled heavy on her shoulders. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't physically resisted. Her strength had been in her knowledge, her composure, and her unwavering refusal to grant them authority they didn't possess. A woman from the group across the street hesitantly approached. She stopped a few feet away, looking unsure. Are you all right? The woman asked softly. Jasmine turned to her, offering a small, genuine smile. Yes, she said. I'm fine. Thank you. The woman nodded, a look of quiet respect on her face. Other people from the group began to cross the street slowly. They didn't rush her, just gathered loosely nearby, their silence now supportive rather than just observational. The air felt different. It was still charged, but with something akin to solidarity. She looked down at the portfolio case in her hand. Her fingers were still gripping it tightly. She consciously relaxed her hand, letting her fingers uncurl slowly. The physical tension began to drain away, leaving behind a different kind of weariness. This wasn't the exhaustion of physical conflict, but the deep fatigue that came from defending one's fundamental rights against casual, arrogant power. She took a deep breath of the night air. It smelled of exhaust fumes and distant rain. The street felt ordinary again, stripped of the sudden, artificial drama the officers had brought. But it wasn't truly ordinary. Something had happened here. A small, quiet assertion had met an attempted overreach, and for a few minutes, the balance had hung precariously. She saw the officers further down the block. They weren't looking back. They were interacting with someone else now, but without the same confident swagger they had displayed with her. Perhaps her quiet resistance had left its mark. Perhaps not. It was hard to tell. The woman who had spoken earlier now stood closer, joined by a man. They didn't ask for details, just offered a silent, understanding presence. Their faces held a mixture of concern and quiet admiration. "They shouldn't do that," the woman said finally, her voice low. Jasmine nodded. "No," she agreed softly. "They shouldn't." She shifted her weight, the feeling returning to her cramped fingers. The weight of the portfolio case felt reassuringly real. It held papers, work, the ordinary things of her life that had been momentarily interrupted by this encounter. She began to walk slowly away from the corner, not in a hurry, but with a quiet purpose. The small group of onlookers followed at a respectful distance for a moment, then dispersed, melting back into the night. The encounter replayed in her mind: Davis's initial confidence, Miller's quiet menace, the sudden shift when she asked for the legal basis, their fumbling attempts to reassert control, and finally, their awkward retreat. She hadn't won anything loud or visible, but she had held her ground. She hadn't been intimidated into compliance by unwarranted authority. The emotional residue lingered. It was a mixture of quiet satisfaction at having stood firm and a persistent weariness that this kind of interaction was necessary at all. The casual assumption of authority, the expectation of unquestioning obedience, it was a constant, low-level hum of potential conflict in certain spaces, for certain people. She walked for several blocks, the rhythmic sound of her footsteps on the pavement the only sound besides the city's distant pulse. The streetlights cast long, shifting shadows. She felt exposed, yet also strangely empowered. The fear hadn't materialized, replaced instead by a cold, sharp focus. Reaching her destination, a community center, she paused outside the entrance. The lights were on inside, warmth and activity promising a different kind of interaction. Before going in, she stood on the steps for a moment, gathering herself. The encounter had taken more out of her than she initially registered. Her shoulders felt tight. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the murmur of voices and the scent of coffee. People looked up as she entered, offering smiles. She smiled back, a practiced, public smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. A colleague approached, looking concerned. "Everything all right? You're a bit late." "Yes, fine," she said, her voice even. "Just a slight delay." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The weight of the interaction remained her own to carry. The emotional impact wasn't a story to be told casually, but a silent, internal marker. Later, during a meeting, her focus was sharp, her contributions precise. No one would guess the street corner standoff minutes before. But the memory was there, a quiet undercurrent. She felt the eyes of others on her, expectant, respectful. The contrast between this environment and the street felt stark. Here, her voice was sought, her presence valued. On the street, it had been questioned, challenged, dismissed. She spoke calmly, articulating complex points with ease. Her hands rested on the table, steady. No trace of the recent tension showed outwardly. But inside, the experience was still settling, a layer added to the long history of similar moments. Each one a small test, a quiet act of defiance against the forces that sought to diminish or control. The meeting continued, the conversation flowing around her. She listened, she contributed, she was present. Yet part of her remained on that street corner, under the flashing lights, holding her ground, her silence more potent than any shout. The officer's shock wasn't just about her knowledge. It was about her stillness, her refusal to be flustered, her quiet command of the moment. They had expected a certain reaction, and she had given them none of it. Walking home much later, under a dark sky, the streets were mostly empty. The silence felt different now, not charged with tension, but simply quiet. She thought about the officers again. Their faces, their postures, their fumbling response. Had they learned anything? Unlikely, she thought. But the encounter had changed her, minutely. Added another layer of resolve, Another confirmation that composure and clarity were powerful weapons. The emotional weight didn't lift entirely. It rarely did after such encounters. It settled into a quiet place, a reminder of the vigilance required, the constant, subtle battle for dignity and respect in spaces where it wasn't automatically granted. The lasting impact wasn't the shock on the officers' faces, though that was a fleeting victory. It was the deeper, internal strengthening, the quiet confirmation of her own power in stillness and truth. The night air felt cool against her skin. She kept walking, steady, purposeful.